Hi, everyone. Welcome to the February edition of the webinar for our CLIVAR working group on accelerating the scientific foundation for climate risk. The group is led by myself, Andy Dessler, Alex Hall, and Adam Sobel, who will be joining us shortly. And we have a wonderful collection of working group members, many of whom are on the call, and one of whom is going to be speaking today, Simona. We've seen a lot of different spaces of climate risk and lots of different angles of looking at it. And tonight we're going to hear from two people. One is John and Simona. John is at the University of California Merced lab, and his work is looking at climate and weather and understanding the impacts on natural resources and society. In particular, today he's going to be talking about wildfires and the escalating control of weather and climate extremes in the U.S. West with respect to wildfires. Without further ado, let's get started hearing John talking about U.S. Western wildfires.
Okay, so yeah, I'm going to talk a little bit about the my title, which is the escalating control of weather and climate on wildfire extremes, and really we're focusing here on risk. And I'm representing the West. I'm representing the dry side today. I think you're going to hear about some of the impacts from the coastal impacts later on. But if, in the Western United States, wildfire is certainly a concern. We've seen that play out year after year. And I think I really have two main messages with my time today. First message is really that today, weather and climate are in the driver's seat for extreme fires in the Western United States and realistically other parts of the globe. But I'm going to focus primarily on the West. And the second point is that climate change is pushing on the accelerator, right? In many ways, not all necessarily all particular risks when it comes to fire, but certain elements of risk. And I'll try to highlight some of that here. So broad overview, we know that wildfire area, probably the easiest measure to track, has increased across the West over the last century or so. Individual years and perhaps even the last decade might be unprecedented, at least with respect to the last century, right? We saw 2020, 2021, big fire years, particularly in forests. But we also know that if we look back at fire activity records from proxy records prior to European colonization of the West, there used to be a lot of fire activity. And what that really tells us is that the level of fire activity, at least in terms of burned area, does not hold a candle to what we saw prior to Western settlement. However, the type of fire that we had back then was very, very different. We did not have fire suppression. We had indigenous communities that were intentionally having fire as a rejuvenative prominence on the landscape. Flash forward to today, fires that we have today are happening under a niche set of conditions, right? They're happening basically when we cannot suppress fires. And that is when you get the trifecta of plentiful fuels, those fuels being dry enough, and then throw in critical fire weather conditions. And so that's the argument that I think I really want to make today, is that that's why climate and weather are in the driver's seat for extreme fires. And this is just showing us sort of what fires look like, at least in terms of burned area, when we compare it to dry forests across the Western US. Again, going back to that tree ring record. And I'll note that that tree ring record is basically trees that did not die during fire, right? Those were low severity fires. The fires that we have today are high severity fires primarily. They're also causing significant impacts. And that's why we talk about them in the context of risk. This is no longer just a process that's happening from an ecological perspective. It's also impacting, of course, communities directly and indirectly. So that's my main message, is that contemporary burning today is primarily happening under extreme conditions when fire suppression is no longer effective. I could go on and talk about the impacts that fire is having in the West, but I'll highlight here just two very brief sort of elements of this. One is that we had a study a couple of years ago looking at sort of how fire is impacting populations. That is, to quantify the population that lives in the line of fire. And one of the fascinating things when it comes to looking at the fire risk insurance markets, et cetera, is that when we just look at fire area, right, just burned area, only about 15% of the burned area in the lower 48 occurs in California. But when we look at the actual fraction of population that lies in the footprint of fires, that number rises to 72%. And that is why California ends up being quite interesting when it comes to many elements of fire risk from the built environment side. Secondary impacts of fire, of course, include the pervasive impacts that wildfire smoke has on populations. That is something that, of course, places not impacted directly by fire have felt, with the recent wildfires burning in Canada, impacting air quality. And some of the estimates here, this is one looking at sort of about, I don't know, 15 years or so, 10 years of data or so over California. Yeah. Again, about 50,000 additional premature deaths due to wildfire smoke. This is loading a lot of PM 2.5 in the atmosphere. And so the list can go on and on, but I'll just highlight those two very briefly. Okay. A lot of people, not necessarily scientists, but popular in popular media, we hear that fire is a California problem, Western US problem, right? But it turns out that this is actually not necessarily the case. Those arguments are that there are fire management issues in the West that are novel, which there are fire management issues, but we're actually seeing these sorts of high intensity fires and also catastrophic fires, fires that either result in a massive loss of life or fires that result in a significant economic damage. The results here globally show that this is not a phenomenon that is confined to the West, but it's happening across the globe. And again, the ingredients for extreme fires really are a trifecta of factors, right? Ignitions, fuels, fuels being dry enough, and then critical fire weather conditions. And I will make the argument that climate plays a role in several of these factors, but maybe more directly, climate enables wildfires to happen. Climate doesn't start fires, but climate allows fuels to be drier, such that, factors may increase the likelihood of ignition. Fires also create a drier fuel bed and a more continuous dry fuel bed that directly results in the increased ability for fires to spread across the landscape. Lots of different ways in which we can show this. On the left-hand side, this is some work that Park Williams and I did, and we've updated some of the years, but effectively we see a really, really strong relationship between just how warm and dry fire seasons are measured by fuel aridity and how much area burns in forests across the West. That's a pretty strong relationship there, acknowledging that fire activity is a lot more than just climate, right? But climate variability is absolutely in the driver's seat in terms of year-to-year variability in burned area in forests. We've also seen changes in that we now have our nighttime temperatures being warmer. We are not getting overnight relative humidity recovery, and that is allowing our nights to be more conducive to burning. Fires traditionally lie down at night, right? And that gives fire suppression crews a leg up on sort of suppressing fires. We've seen some of those brakes come off that essentially have traditionally slowed fires down. Likewise, fires have also increased in elevation. They move to higher elevations, more mesic environments. Places that used to resist fire are now burning. Very, very briefly, we know that the fire relationships actually vary as a function of what is burning, right? Vegetation is sort of a continuum, for fire to spread on. When we talk about the role that climate and climate change have on wildfire, there's some pretty strong differences between what we would consider flammability limited systems, which are effectively generally fuel-rich environments, places where we have usually sufficient fuel, places that typically only burn when it's dry enough. And that is that the other ingredients are there. Fuels are there. Ignitions can sometimes be limited. But this is primarily our forests that we see in the West. And realistically, much of the rest of the globe, we see very similar relationships there, which is that fire activity is enabled when we have unusually dry fire seasons. On the flip side, in the grassland environments and from some shrubland environments, these environments are often usually pretty dry, right? Perennially, they're dry. That's not necessarily a limiting factor, but oftentimes what will enable large fires in those systems is having a wet year that increases biomass productivity, increases fuel connectivity. And so the relationships in those systems can look quite a bit different. Okay, I'm going to show a little bit of preliminary work, and then I'll show you 3 really quick vignettes from some published work. A lot of this is work that not just a lot of other folks have contributed to this. So my main point here is that extreme fire is really behind a significant portion of the burned area, as well as a lot of the fire disasters, the disasters that we see making the media, the disasters that end up resulting in significant losses of life, significant economic damages. Left-hand side here, this is looking at daily burned area across ecoregions in the Western United States. And here what I'm plotting is the fraction of burned area that's happened over the last 25 years that occurs in the top 1% of days defined by this fire weather index, which is essentially a metrics that integrates the long-term drying of fuels along with the effect of windy and dry conditions. You can see, probably your eyes are directly drawn to South Coastal California. And in that particular area, we see over a third of the burned area happening in that top 1% of days. So these sorts of extreme fire weather days are critically important in driving the bulk of the fire activity. If we change this threshold to like 95th percentile, we'll see a lot more. But the top 1% of days is contributing an outsized portion of the daily burned area. Likewise, when we look at the fire disasters, those are the significant ones that we had in this database from Cunningham that we published last year. Most of those have happened during absolutely exceptional fire weather conditions. So a small subset of fires are the fires that we care about, the fires that cause impacts, and they preferentially are happening under this niche set of fire weather conditions. Okay, let's go big scale first. And this is sort of thinking about what factors are really important for very, very large fire years, right? The Western United States saw an exceptional fire year in 2020. A lot of stuff was going down in 2020. Beyond the climate we had in that year, essentially a monsoon. There's no monsoon at all in the West. The lowest year we've seen probably in the last 30 years for lightning, but the lightning that did happened unfortunately in a place that was quite dry, in California, a little bit in Oregon. And then we had a very, very strong downslope wind event that sort of synchronized fires from Washington State all the way down to California. And in that year, we saw a huge amount of burned area. Similar sort of events have played out in Southeast Australia in 1920 and Canada in 2023. And what we end up seeing is that globally, these extreme fire years, the years where we've seen the most amount of fire in the MODIS satellite era, tend to occur, not surprisingly, when we have chronically high periods of fire danger, right? In this case, the fire weather index exceeding the 95th percentile, number of days exceeding that level. And in these 3 cases, effectively, we see those years with the most amount of burned area happening when we have the number of days exceeding the 95th percentile of, being like a 1 in 20 year return period, okay? When we scale that globally, we end up seeing something quite similar. I'm going to save you some details if you want to see those details. This is published last year. We've also sort of taken what we found globally and we scaled that going forward, looking at a suite of CMIP6, sort of not necessarily large ensembles, but medium ensembles, if you will, and asked basically how much more likely are these 1 in 20 year fire weather conditions that have catalyzed these extreme fire seasons in forests, how much more likely are they today under today's current climate than they were in a pre-industrial climate? The story is not too much of a surprise here. In many parts of the globe, this is much more likely. I'll just point out here the Sierra Nevada of California. We see that the risk of these 1 in 20 year fire weather conditions, not necessarily one of the most important ingredients, not the only ingredient. It's about twice as likely today versus a pre-industrial climate. Okay, move on to the second part, which is sort of a study that we have, I guess, now in revision, led by Dmitry Kalishnikov, who's a postdoc working with me. And we set out to look at the role that heat waves have on extreme summer fires. Heat waves, of course, are important from health perspective, obviously increase energy demand, etc. And we've long suspected that heat waves are important in terms of being a catalyst for fire activity on short timescales. And what we did here was we defined heat waves using traditional methods. We had daily burned area from MODIS, And we looked at sort of conditions prior to heat waves, conditions during heat waves, and then conditions in the few days post heat waves, given the idea that heat waves are actually doing a number of things to increase fire potential. They lead to rapid fuel drying, longer burn periods, right? Lack of overnight humidity recovery. We also find in this particular study that there's a significant increase in the number of lightning ignitions, which is this natural fire. Yeah, you can have fire from volcanoes, but realistically, lightning is the natural fire that we think about. So there's a significant uptick in lightning-caused fires. And then oftentimes what happens once the heat wave breaks down, we usually have some sort of a cold front come through. And so that ends up allowing for this continuation of extreme burning conditions post heat wave. We've seen again the continuation of increases in forest fire activity over the last 25 years or so. This is the MODIS period. We also here in this study particularly see that heat waves, actually, most of this increase that we've seen in forested burned area during the summer has occurred during heat wave events. We do not see this at all show up in the non-forested environments, which again is suggesting that those non-forested environments, at least what controls fire activity in those particular systems, is quite different, right? It's a function of fuel continuity, etc. So that's a completely different story. Okay, let me move on to the last vignette here, and this is perhaps the sort of fires that I think are most consequential, the sort of fires that probably keep me up the most at night thinking about. And these fires we know by name, which means they're notorious, right? These are sort of a suite of fires that we would consider fires that occur coincident with downslope wind-driven events, right? Probably most notorious are the Santa Ana wind events, but these occur across much of the western United States where we have topography, and it often ends up being that people live not necessarily at the top of the mountain, but they live downwind in some capacity. These fires are really, really fascinating because fire generally wants to move uphill, right? Just through heat release, fire wants to move uphill. Usually we have sort of upslope flow during the daytime when fire activity is most pronounced. And that usually moves fires away from communities. But downslope wind-driven fires do the opposite. They bring fires to communities. This is an example of one of these events that happened in Labor Day of 2020, where we had very unusually cold air mass that came in through the Rockies. I believe there was some snowfall falling in parts of the Colorado Rockies, huge ridge off the coast, and we saw extremely strong downslope winds starting from Washington State, really strong in Oregon, and then it continued in the subsequent days into California. And this particular event led to the Labor Day fires in Oregon, where I think over a period of 4 days or so, the Oregon Cascades had more burned area than they had in the previous 40 years combined, something like that. In Washington State, the day earlier, there were wind-driven fires that took out some small communities. And then in the subsequent days following this Labor Day fire event, the active fires that were burning in California, primarily the lightning-caused fires, got a significant boost from this particular event. So these are really, really fascinating weather-driven phenomena that interact with the other factors that are important for fire, namely abundant fuel and also dry fuel. We've done some studies sort of trying to highlight just, where, when, and how important these downslope wind-driven fires are. And we have this database of downslope winds, and we have existing databases of fire activity. And this is showing us just a few sort of general pictures of where these fires occur, how frequent they are, how much of the fire activity locally they account for. And you can clearly see Southern California being highlighted here quite well. Of course, you think about how many people live between San Diego and Santa Barbara. That's a lot of exposure there, particularly from this sort of subset of fires. And when we look at some of the impacts that these fires have had, and this is sort of pooling across all of the impacts that we've seen from fires, I think from like 2000 to 2020, we find that over half of the structural losses in fire and over half of the fatalities in wildfires in the Western United States occur during these downslope wind-driven fires. I failed to mention that these fires only really account for about 10 to 12% of the burned area, 10 to 12% of the fires themselves, but again, an outsized proportion of the losses. Okay. And then really brief, I'm just going to sort of highlight a little attribution study that Linnea Hawkins out of Oregon State led a couple years ago. And again, the idea is that these sort of downslope wind-driven fires happen when we have downslope winds, but also really dry fuels, right? And so that's why like the LA fires happened, because we had essentially no precipitation. The live fuel moisture, the dead fuel moisture was completely toast. And then we had a critical fire weather event, right? If you remove one of those ingredients, if it was wet and we still had those winds, probably wouldn't be a fire to speak of. This is looking at a set of what we consider to be extreme fires at some point when we published the paper. They all happened under incredible conditions, effectively like 1 in 20 year daily maximum fire weather index, different metrics you can look at, just absolutely extreme conditions, all pretty notable. And then using a RegGCM simulation, where we took 1,000 simulations with CO2 forcing, 1,000 simulations without CO2 forcing, we effectively looked at the frequency of 1 in 20 year daily fire weather extremes. So this is complementary to the 1 in 20 year sort of regional fire risk measure. And we essentially looked at how much more frequent these would be with the CO2 forcing versus without CO2 forcing. And the story here, at least for one measure, the fire weather index, is that there is a significant, these sorts of extremes are significantly more likely from effectively the Bay Area northward. You see about a 40 to 50% increase in the likelihood of these sorts of 1 in 20 year extremes. And it's interesting because these are happening despite the models and other studies generally suggesting a slight decrease in the probability of strong offshore winds with climate change. And that's effectively due to this fact that we see enhanced warming over the interior, and that's an additional forcing agent. The story here is that the drying tends to outweigh the sort of influence of the strengthening of or the decline in the wind speeds. Okay, I think I'll end there, and I'm just going to sort of show here just these 3 main points. Again, my main point was that climate and weather extremes are in the driver's seat for extreme fire activity, and realistically, extreme fire activity drives a lot of the burned area that we see in the West, right? A lot of the interannual variability in fire activity, very much controlled by interannual variability in climate. I highlighted that climate change has increased the odds of certain flavors of extremes conducive to fires. I've primarily emphasized the forested fire side because that's where the drying effect is most present. Changes in interannual variability, changes in biomass, those things that are going to influence fuels on the grassland side, a little bit more unknown. And then finally, like our current approach for managing vegetation, managing fire risk is essentially not working. Obviously, there's things that can be done to mitigate that. People are thinking about these things. But at the same time, climate change is going to continue to amplify these risks for fire extremes. And that is putting the onus on sort of focusing on the bottom-up factors, things that we can control today, while we sort of figure out the climate change angle. I'm going to end there, and I'm happy to turn it back and answer any questions folks have.
Great. Well, thank you for that very interesting talk. There are a few questions in the chat. First question, given that wildfire risk is increasing across the Western US, with climate change hitting the accelerator, as you say, is there any way to account for potential ecosystem regime shift associated with the burning rate, forest to grassland? Many models don't include this.
Mm-hmm. That's right. Yeah. So certainly you can get type transitions where as you have large fires, high severity fires, and now you have a warmer climate, you may not, those forests may not come back, and you may transition to a sort of grassland environment. I think there are sophisticated models that can deal with those transitions. However, I would say that those are uncertainties. A lot of the sort of projections when it comes to fire risk tend to focus on the near-term risks, with the idea that we don't have to worry necessarily about how vegetation is going to change. As we get further out, probably some more unknowns.
Another question, is there a climatological tipping point beyond which fires are a part of transition from forested to non-forested ecosystems? Any paleoclimate perspective to draw on? I think that's really a question I've had also.
I don't know of a tipping point. I mean, the tipping point, I guess you're thinking a little bit about whether there's some sort of, again, change in regime between forest and non-forest, or a tipping point whereby fires become much more likely. I think, there's these things suggesting that there's some non-linearities. Even this one plot I showed you was essentially sort of how it was going back here. We'll just go back to it. Yeah, this one here was suggesting this relationship between how warm and dry conditions are in the summer and how much burned area happens. This is a non-linear relationship, but it could also plateau at some point, right? Such that if you get so dry, you're not going to get any more fire activity because you've saturated the system.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the way I was thinking about it was that, in today's climate, we have a forest in one area, and then if you go to a 2-degree C world, you have a forest in a different area. And how do you get there? The forests don't walk like Ents in Lord of the Rings. You burn the forest down here, and then you grow the forest somewhere else. And so, maybe that's happening. We're losing forests here. They're never going to come back because the climate's changed.
I think that is happening. I think there's some evidence of these zombie forests where, they're going to come back as shrubs. And there's evidence to suggest that forest is moving northward, but slowly.
All right, so another question. There is recent work by Simpson 2024 showing that many ESMs do not show the correct trend in VPD compared to observations, suggesting there might be some sort of structural issue in the models. What does that mean for thinking about fire risk? Are there other basic science questions we need to be thinking about in order to better understand fire risk?
Yeah, this is a really interesting question. And I think when we look at even the modeled simulations of fire weather, they are all underestimating what we've seen in the West and other places realistically. So there's a lot of similarities there. It is a little bit concerning that if we're making projections based on these climate models and we're missing something, then we could be significantly underestimating the risk, at least in terms of these dry extremes.
Thanks, John. Yeah, it's so interesting to see, clear evidence of how the hazard is changing in future and ongoing and into the future. And then also thinking about the challenges of the modeling frameworks we have for evaluating future risk. I think that's one of the themes that this working group has really grappled with. And but now we're going to pivot over from the hazard side to looking at how, potentially this kind of changing hazard is internalized in insurance markets. And that is also, I think, a central theme to this working group's activity is looking at the risk base all the way from hazard to exposure, vulnerability, and risk as a whole. So with that, we'll turn it over to Simona Meiler, who is a postdoc at Stanford University currently. Her work is on weather and climate risk, and she studies how hazard, exposure, vulnerability interact to shape the risks and impacts of extreme weather, both today and in a changing climate. Turn it over to you now, Simona. And again,
thank you for the introduction. I'm going to switch a little bit from wildfires in the West to tropical cyclones, or hurricanes as they're called, in the East, and also move a bit further down the impact view with my work. So I'm going to talk about stress testing insurance market stability under climate risk. And sort of my motivation to talk about this originated from also the conversations we had within this working group, which was around how, what are users or use cases of regional climate risk information. And I always thought, well, I'm working on one of such use cases. So I want to start my presentation with an introduction to one of the projects that I've been doing in collaboration with the US Federal Reserve's Insurance Policy Advisory Committee. And they basically had the goal of tracking potential economic losses from hurricanes all the way through the entire insurance market. So including insurers, reinsurers, cap bonds, some of the risk transfer mechanisms, all the way to public backstops, to then assess whether this insurance market and potential spillover of some losses into the wider financial market constitutes a systemic threat to the entirety of the United States. So they picked Florida and the hurricane sort of as their case study to look at, and they invited me to collaborate and perform a risk propagation model. So some of the work that I'm showing today is based on this collaboration, and then I'll also show some work that is then really just my academic curiosity, I would say, that is building on this initial idea. So to start, I think I first need to understand and maybe explain also this insurance market. So there is not just insurance as sort of the primary layer, but we can think of it as a complex web of insurers, reinsurers, some additional markets. And if we start with the first layer of risk absorption in Florida, we have private wind insurance, we have citizens as the residual market, then we have flood insurance that is covered through the NFIP, and we have some of the losses that remain underinsured or uninsured and stay with the homeowners. Then in a second sort of like step or layer, we have a risk transfer and capital support system. So there is reinsurers, we have cat bonds, we also have private insurers that can access some of group capitals or surplus to buffer some of their risk. And this layer really just redistributes risk across these entities. And then we can think of a final layer where we have backstops and public policy support. And these activate once all of that second layer risk transfer has been exhausted. So with this rough overview, I should mention that in this work here, I'm not tracking the uninsured losses further. So I'm quantifying what is insured losses, what is uninsured, but then I'm not tracking the possible implications to the wider financial market of uninsured losses, which would be important and is probably work for the future. But today I'm going to talk about stress testing the insurance market itself. And sort of like with this architecture of these like three-layered insurance market, I basically packed that into a risk propagation model, which forms the core of my simulations. I then need a lot of data, obviously, to inform this whole risk propagation. So I have county-specific values for the different insurer exposures. For example, I know about some policy terms. I know I have information on capital and surplus to sort of inform the risk propagation model. Then I need something to stress this market with. So I'm building scenarios. I'm taking two approaches here where I either look at historical events for like historical single or sequential events, or then I move to a probabilistic assessment of the systemic risks using synthetic data. So I think, yeah, we have the model, we have the data, we have the stressors, and then we also need to think about some of the output metrics, because I think, especially when I started this work, it was not clear to me at which level that you would talk about a systemic risk, or where you would talk about this is actually a level of concern. So I decompose losses, I quantify public burden, but then I also think about what are some metrics that are indicative of a systemic stress. So next, I would like to talk a little bit more about the stress test scenario development. So this is basically the hazard or impact side of things. And if you look at historical hurricanes, you have normalized values. What you see here are bar plots of the 50 most costliest hurricanes in the United States. And Florida ranks quite high on this list. So I just picked 4 of the highest impact events to stress test the system with. I also added like stylized sequential series where you could imagine that you would have a Great Miami Hurricane and Hurricane Andrew in the same season, or like double events of 2 Great Miami Hurricanes or 2 Hurricane Irmas to, stress the system enough. And one difficulty is that if you work with these like normalized values, they're not per se the input into a stress test, because what we actually want is county-wide loss data. What I then did, it was, instead of like using these aggregate numbers, I was looking at the historical catalog of these terms, and then applied a simple approach to compute county-wide loss estimates, and then did a check whether my loss estimates actually fall within the ranges of these normalized values. And because they do, I figured this is like fit for purpose in the sense of stress testing my system. Now I have these county-wide losses that actually then just act as a stressor to this risk propagation model. And we can now look at some of the results. It's probably easiest if we really just start with this loss decomposition. You see the different scenarios that I picked on like next to each other, and then we have a loss decomposition into this primary risk absorption layer. And what's important to note here is that the share above the black line in the gray bars indicates what remains uninsured. So this is like really the part of losses that goes back to homeowners or stays with homeowners. And also in this work is not part of the further assessment of the risk. So I have to flag that. And I think this on the order of 60% uninsured home losses for homeowners is quite high. Then if we track the remainder of these losses through account for reinsurance, account for cat bonds and like capital support, we can then quantify the public burden of these initial losses. And by public burden, I really just mean whatever is left after we've accounted for all the risk transfer mechanisms. And I think the message here is that, for example, if you look at the Florida Hurricane Catastrophe Fund, which regulates the reinsurance, this seems to be this institution that is not as stressed as the other ones. So it hardly, or like it triggers for the Great Miami Hurricane, but then not really for the other single events. And in contrast, you have the citizens, or you have the NFIP that accrue much more of residual losses. So these are maybe some sort of like flags that part of the insurance system is more under stress. Yeah, I think we talking about risk metrics, we had a loss decomposition, we had like this public burden assessment here. Now thinking a bit more in a systemic lens, I was also thinking, okay, the private market cares about number of company defaults. So this is what you see on the left-hand side here. Or then you could relate these like public burden estimates to like their respective assessment capacity or premium base, and then compute some sort of a stress factor. And to understand that, maybe you would just want to look at the Great Miami Hurricane. And then if you think about the public burden that it induced would be for the NFIP, for example, a 10-fold of their annual premium base, or for citizens, it would be a 7-fold of their maximum assessment capacity. So I think with this type of metric, we now have a better understanding of what this total of a public burden would then mean in relation to the respective assessment capacity. So I think this is then more of a systemic risk indicator that we can communicate and that actually tells something about the systemic risk. This sort of concludes my work that I also did with the US Federal Reserve's IPAC. So I did this single event or sequential event stress test for them. And at this point, I was like, okay, I built this whole risk propagation model. And I actually think there are a couple of interesting questions that I could also address with a synthetic set of tropical cyclones. So I used the MIT model. I have an ERA 5 baseline representing just the present day risk. And then I have future climate simulations. And in each case, I built a 10,000 year long tropical cyclone event set, and now use that to stress the insurance market. So with this, I can ask a different set of questions. So now I can ask, for example, what is the annual probability of the private market seeing more than 10 company defaults? And the answer from my assessment would be, well, the annual probability is 12%. I also have like a full range of like all the 10,000 years. So I see that in 84% of the years, we see 0 company defaults, but then in almost 60% we see at least 1 company go in default. And then from there, it picks up rapidly where we see 12% of the years have a number of 10 companies or higher that default. So this is really just to highlight that with a probabilistic approach, we can ask a different set of questions. And if we now look at other metrics, for example, I now take these like public burden estimates, but then relate them to their respective assessment capacity or premium base. and now can quantify what is the annual probability of some of these institutions suffering like systemic stress. Or I could then also say I kind of like combine all of that institutional stress and relate that total public burden to Florida's GDP. So we now have like an aggregate metric of what is the public burden, or like what is the annual probability of the public burden exceeding 1% or 10% of Florida's GDP. And when I kind of like looked at like this setup, I was also thinking, okay, I can stress the model with the tropical cyclones, so the actual events, but then there's also a lot of talk about the market itself shifting. So I figured I want to pick up some of that in a stylized way where everyone talks about market exits, whether that is big insurers pulling out of the wildfire insurance market in California, or that is smaller statewide insurers in Florida running out of business. There is a shift in the market itself. So I represent that in a stylized way, or I was also thinking about using that quantitative framework to then play around with some adaptation policies, if you want to say. So I increased the insurance penetration, or then increased sort of the building code standards to see how this shifts systemic risks. And if we look at these indicators again, just in a quick way for the simulations of a market exit case, well, the risk or the annual probability of private company defaults decreases just because there are fewer actors in the market, but then the stress on citizens increases. So this is not surprising, but I think it's interesting to be able to quantify that. In the case of a higher insurance penetration, I was initially a bit surprised to see that the probability for company defaults actually picks up, and also the other metrics in some cases. What I did was basically shifting some of the uninsured exposure into the private insurer market, and then I would also increase the private insurers' capital linearly to their increase in risk that they're holding. But obviously what we learned from this assessment is that we would need to capitalize the private insurance market non-linearly to buffer the addition of the extra exposure that they now cover. So I think it's interesting that we learn that if we switch something in that risk propagation model, how some of the other pieces react, and we can then also think about which knobs that we need to turn to make that system actually more resilient if we make changes to it. And then the case of the building codes, well, it's, I guess, an effective policy option, so to say, because you reduce the loss before it enters the actual market. So all these stressors go down. And I think it is interesting to see that we can just use this quantitative framework to play around with options that trigger or like act on different levels of this risk propagation. And then, I mean, I can do the same exercise by using future climate tropical cyclone simulations. So going back to looking at the probability for private company defaults, we had a baseline of 12% annually for the era 5 baseline. If we look at the mid-century, this increases to 16%. If we look at an end-of-century SSP 585 scenario, the probability increases to 20%. And my message here is, and you heard me say this before, there are large uncertainties when you work with tropical cyclone simulations. So the actual ranges of like the 10th to the 90th percentile show quite high range of some of these metrics changing. The picture for the other stressors doesn't look much different. We again see that the reinsurance seems to be a somewhat robust angle in this whole insurance system, and then other metrics are a bit more sensitive to changes. And like finally, I was thinking I can actually now with this framework also think about, for example, how much building code related loss reduction would be needed to offset risk increase from tropical cyclone changes in the middle of the century. So I just did this as an additional exercise of saying, what if I combined some of the policy measures with some of the tropical cyclone risk increase? And what you see here is sort of a simple back of the envelope stylized calculation of what you would need to do, or like how much that a building code related loss reduction would need to be to offset climate change. And if you look at the black solid line, you see that for the median scenario, it's around 80% to be effective. But if you look at sort of the lower bound and pick the climate models that simulate a smaller tropical cyclone risk increase, then maybe already a 30 to 40% of building code related loss reduction would offset the climate signal. And yeah, I think with that, I want to summarize. I think what I showed is a quantitative insurance market stress test. I've seen a lot of either qualitative work in this sector or then quantitative assessments of a subpart of that system. I think this quantitative comprehensive work then also allows us to assess sort of the shifting market dynamics, some stylized policy options or future climate signals in the same quantitative framework. And I also think importantly, this can be a blueprint for other regions. So I played this through for the Florida insurance market, but basically this also holds for many of the other insurance market and would also hold for the whole of the United States insurance market altogether. I'm at the end of my presentation and happy to take some questions. I'll stop sharing now.
Great. Well, thanks a lot. That was really, really interesting. I'll ask a question first. So where do you get the data to do this? Like,
That's a good question.
not the tropical cyclone data, the risks, but like the financial insurance data.
I am always stumbling over the acronyms, but a lot of that data is actually publicly accessible. So I think a lot of that is actually publicly available. So it takes some digging through PDFs and Excel files and then downloading data from search queries online, but you can get sort of the share of policies that are written or the total insured values of private insurers and citizens, and the NFIP is mostly publicly accessible too. So I think all of that data is somewhere out there.
All right, so let's see, questions. Fran Moore, when admitted insurers go bankrupt, their unpaid claims are passed to the remaining insurers in the state via the guarantee fund. Do you propagate that onward through the industry?
No, I think all I do is I calculate that residual that is like calculate how much that would go back to policyholders, but I don't propagate that further.
Does your stress test methodology assume that markets are functioning normally? If markets were not functioning normally, e.g., such as during the September-October 2008 financial crisis, would this impact the ultimate outcome in terms of carrier stability, effectiveness of backstops, et cetera?
Yeah, I think my stress test really just assumes an average 2024 market without any crazy things.
Do you think that the model would still stand and work, say, if you did look at the California wildfires and the insurance companies pulling out of California, or do you think that is very specific to tropical cyclones?
No, I think it would still hold. I think what is a bit tricky in the United States is that some of the states have different regulations, and then also some of the states it's harder to actually get the data, where I think Florida is a good case where a lot of that data that I used is publicly available. I think in other states that would be a bit harder to get by, but I think the general thinking and like framework should hold for any state. And like honestly, I think what would be interesting is to do that, because I think everything's linked. So I would actually love to do the same exercise for California in the same season as for Florida, and then see if there is what would happen if you had lots of wildfires in the west and then more tropical cyclones in the east. So I think that would be the true stress test, where I think this is somewhat of a first quantitative comprehensive assessment of an isolated market, but there's obviously more to that.
Yeah, great talk, Simona. I was interested in the result that the probability for 10 companies failing is almost the same as the probability for one company failing. So that's interesting. And I guess one is a simple factual question, the other is maybe more interesting, but the factual question is how many companies are in the sample. So is 10 companies a lot, or is 10 companies not a lot? And this seems like a lot to me, but I don't know. And then do you understand this? I mean, is there some structural reason why a lot of companies have basically the same threshold for failure, such that once one goes, they all go, or is it some other dynamic that connects them, or what's happening there?
Yeah, to your first question, I think there is what I explicitly represent is around 100 companies. So 10 is 10%. I think that is, like, honestly, I think that is quite a high number. I think there were reports from Hurricane Ian where there were 6 or 7 company defaults after that event. And I think I have an understanding of why my values are a bit higher than what you would expect from maybe one of the insurance models. We could talk about that too. Yeah, but I think the other piece is why is the 1 to 10 barrier so close connected? I think it's always just like small statewide operating companies that probably don't have a large. So I looked at the ratio of losses to company surplus, and I think this gives you a pretty good first indication of how well funded these companies are, and there are just a few of the small players. And I think if you reach a certain level of loss or magnitude, I think that just like maybe flips a switch for these smaller companies. But I haven't looked into like single companies exactly, and I have a beginning understanding, but I wouldn't know exactly why this is like a pretty abrupt change in that relationship. And it also,
I
like,
guess the other
honestly, it also
question would be
sort of like plateaus after that.
what about going from, it plateaus, so going from 10 to 20?
Yeah,
Is
it's not that it
probably?
picks up and then grows exponentially, but it's like after a certain threshold, it kind of like plateaus, and then you can increase the losses almost indefinitely, and you don't really see many more companies defaulting.
That's comforting. Anyway, thanks.
Okay, probably our last question, unless it's very short. Fran, do you want to go?
Sure, thanks. One wanted to say, like, this is really awesome stuff, and question, like, is there a working paper, or is it published? And then a kind of a question / suggestion, I guess, on the simulations going forward. I mean, a lot of the concentration of this kind of tail risk problem in Florida is about kind of population changes and like asset location and kind of interacting like the climate simulations with these kind of other simulations around what that like growth and exposure might or might not look like, might be a kind of interesting way to go.
Cool. Yeah. Thank you. I'm writing a paper, so give me, I don't know, 4 or 5 more weeks. I hope I can share a preprint then.
I guess any last questions?
I had mine up. I loved your last, or towards the end, you had the figure about how much building code, so how much risk reduction would you have to do to offset climate change? And the figures you're getting are in the range of what the Florida building code has added. I mean, James Doan has put it at something like 75% risk reduction. So it's in the realm. The problem is that you also have increasing exposure growth compounding your climate growth. So have you tried to like add in that combined exposure plus hazard, and how is it physically possible to reduce enough with your building code in that case?
Yeah, I haven't tried. I was a bit careful about throwing in too many things at the same time. So I sort of decided to keep the risk propagation and exposure at the 2024 level, and then just tweak some of the other knobs. But I think, yeah, that would probably be worth an exercise to include that in addition.
All right, it's 11:59. We might as well wrap it up here. I want to thank our speakers. So thanks a lot, and thanks to all the attendees for showing up. This is a really great meeting, and look for our next webinar. Bye, everybody.